In the brutal winter of 1843, when the Tennessee mountains held secrets darker than their deepest valleys, a widow's desperate flight with her triplet daughters would collide with the fury of a Cherokee war chief whose hatred for white settlers had turned his heart to stone. What began as an act of cruelty by her own people would become a test of mercy that would forever change the fate of two worlds standing on the edge of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The settlement of Millfield Creek sat like a festering wound in the heart of the Cherokee. Nation's ancestral lands, a collection of hastily built cabins and dreams constructed on promises as hollow as the treaty papers that had supposedly guaranteed the land to white settlers. Nestled between the rolling foothills of the Smoky Mountains, the community of barely 60 souls had carved out their existence through sheer determination and willful ignorance of the growing anger that surrounded them on all sides. It was December of 1843, and the bitter winds that swept down from the mountain peaks carried more than just the promise of snow. They carried the whispers of Cherokee war parties moving through the forests, the rumble of federal troops marching toward what many believed would be the final confrontation between the United States government and the last free Cherokee bands, refusing to walk the Trail of Tears to the distant Oklahoma Territory. In this powder keg of racial tension and political maneuvering lived Rebecca Ashworth, a woman whose very existence had become a burden to the community that had once welcomed her family with open arms. At 28, Rebecca possessed the kind of quiet strength that comes from weathering storms that would break lesser souls. Her auburn hair prematurely streaked with silver and her green eyes holding depths of sorrow that spoke of losses too. Profound for words, Rebecca had arrived in Millfield Creek 3 years earlier with her husband Daniel, a skilled blacksmith whose services were desperately needed in the growing settlement. Daniel Ashworth had been a man of principle, respected for his craftsmanship and admired for his gentle nature with both humans and animals. More importantly, he had been one of the few white settlers who treated the Cherokee people with genuine respect, learning their language and often serving as an unofficial translator during the tense negotiations that periodically erupted between the community and the native tribes. Daniel's progressive views had made him valuable, but never entirely trusted by his neighbors. Jeremiah Caldwell, the settlement's self-appointed leader and a man whose grandfather had fought Cherokee warriors in the Revolutionary War, had always viewed Daniel's friendliness toward the natives with suspicion. "Mark my words," Caldwell would mutter to his cronies around the general store's pot-bellied stove. "A man who consorts with savages will eventually be corrupted by their heathen ways." The Ashworth family had lived quietly on the outskirts of Millfield Creek, Daniel working his forge, while Rebecca tended their small farm and raised their 3 daughters. The triplets, Faith, Hope, and Grace, had been born during the harsh winter of 1838, their arrival a miracle that had nearly cost Rebecca her life. At 5 years old, the girls were identical in appearance, but distinct in temperament, their golden hair and bright blue eyes making them favorites throughout the settlement, despite the whispered concerns about their father's political leanings. Faith, the eldest by mere minutes, possessed a fierce independence that often led her into trouble. She climbed trees higher than any boy her age, challenged older children to races she usually won, and asked questions that made adults uncomfortable with their probing intelligence. Hope, the middle child, was the peacemaker of the trio, blessed with an intuitive understanding of human nature that allowed her to diffuse conflicts before they escalated. Grace, the youngest, was the dreamer, often found staring at the mountains with an expression of longing that suggested her spirit was already wandering the hidden trails beyond the settlement's boundaries. The 3 girls were inseparable, moving through their daily routines with the synchronized precision of dancers who had practiced their steps since birth. They shared everything: clothes, toys, secrets, and an almost telepathic ability to communicate without words. The bond between them was so strong that when one fell ill, the other two would often display the same symptoms within hours. And when one laughed, the others would begin giggling before they even heard the joke. This extraordinary connection had made them objects of fascination and increasingly suspicion within Millfield Creek. Old women whispered about unnatural bonds and the strange ways of children who seemed to know things they shouldn't know. When Hope had warned her mother about a storm that wouldn't arrive for 2 days, or when Grace had cried inconsolably the morning before news arrived of a Cherokee attack on a settlement 50 miles away, the superstitious elements of the community began to view the triplets with growing unease. Daniel had dismissed these concerns with characteristic good humor, proud of his daughter's intelligence and intuitive abilities. "They're bright girls with active imaginations," he would tell Rebecca when she worried about the neighbors' whispered conversations. "The world needs more children who think for themselves, not fewer." But Daniel's protective presence had been brutally removed from their lives 8 months ago when a fever swept through Millfield Creek like wildfire, claiming 12 lives, including that of the settlement's most skilled craftsman. Daniel had worked tirelessly to help other families, using his strength to dig graves and his gentle nature to comfort the grieving, until the fever claimed him as well. Rebecca had watched helplessly as her husband wasted away over the course of 6 terrible days, his strong hands growing weak and his voice becoming a whisper as he struggled to breathe. In his final moments, as the triplets slept exhausted in the next room, Daniel had gripped Rebecca's hand with surprising strength and whispered words that would haunt her dreams for months to come. "Promise me," he had gasped, his eyes burning with fever and desperation. "Promise me you'll keep them safe. The Cherokee, they're not what people think. If trouble comes, if you have no other choice, remember little Wolf. He knows, he understands." Rebecca had promised, though she hadn't understood what her dying husband was trying to tell her. Little Wolf was a Cherokee warrior who had occasionally visited Daniel's forge, trading furs and game for metal tools and horseshoes. The two men had developed a mutual respect, despite the language barrier and cultural differences, but Rebecca had never imagined that this relationship might someday become important to her family's survival. In the months following Daniel's death, Rebecca had struggled to maintain both the forge and the farm while caring for 3 energetic 5-year-olds. The physical demands were exhausting, but the emotional toll was even greater. Without Daniel's income and protection, the Ashworth family's position in Millfield Creek had become increasingly precarious. The settlement's attitude toward Rebecca and her daughters had shifted dramatically after Daniel's death. Where once they had been welcomed, if not entirely trusted, they were now viewed as burdens on a community already stretched thin by the constant threat of Cherokee raids and the uncertainty of their legal claim to the disputed lands. Jeremiah Caldwell had been the first to voice what many were thinking but were too polite to say aloud. "A woman alone with 3 children can't maintain a forge," he had declared during a town meeting in November. "The settlement needs a blacksmith who can work full-time, not a widow who's trying to do a man's job while raising babies." The criticism had stung, but Rebecca had persevered, working longer hours and accepting help from the few neighbors who still showed kindness to her family. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the settlement's physician, had been particularly supportive, often bringing food and medicine for the triplets, while praising Rebecca's courage in the face of overwhelming challenges. But even Dr. Morrison's support hadn't been enough to protect the Ashworth family from the growing sentiment that they had become a liability to Millfield Creek's survival. The tipping point had come 3 weeks ago, when a Cherokee raiding party had struck a farmstead just 10 miles from the settlement, killing 2 men and burning their cabin to the ground. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The attack had sent panic through Millfield Creek, with families barricading themselves in their homes and armed patrols walking the settlement's perimeter day and night. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, the fact that Rebecca's husband had maintained friendly relations with Cherokee warriors was suddenly seen not as an asset, but as evidence of dangerous sympathies. How do we know she hasn't been passing information to them? Thomas Brennan, the settlement's store owner, had whispered during one of the emergency meetings called to discuss defensive measures. Her husband was always talking to those savages. Who's to say she hasn't continued the practice? The accusation was groundless and cruel, but it had taken root in the fertile soil of community fear. Within days, subtle forms of ostracism had begun. Customers stopped coming to the forge, even for emergency repairs. Children were forbidden to play with Faith, Hope, and Grace, leaving the triplets confused and hurt by the sudden isolation. Store credit was quietly revoked, forcing Rebecca to rely on her dwindling savings to purchase basic necessities. The final blow had come when Rebecca had approached Caldwell directly, seeking to trade work for food and supplies. The settlement leader had listened to her proposal with a cold expression that made her blood run cold, his grey eyes holding none of the sympathy she had hoped to find. "Mrs. Ashworth," he had said with mock formality, "I'm afraid the settlement has reached a difficult decision regarding your family's future here in Millfield Creek." Rebecca had felt her heart sink as she recognized the tone of a man delivering an ultimatum. "What kind of decision, Mr. Caldwell?" Caldwell had straightened in his chair, assuming the posture of a judge delivering sentence. "The community has voted. Given your inability to contribute meaningfully to our defense and the questionable loyalties your family has demonstrated, we believe it would be best for all concerned if you and your daughters sought opportunities elsewhere." The words had hit Rebecca like physical blows. Are you asking us to leave? I'm telling you that your presence here has become a burden and a security risk, Caldwell had replied bluntly. We've prepared a wagon with basic supplies. You have until tomorrow morning to gather your belongings and depart Millfield Creek permanently. Rebecca had stared at the man in disbelief, unable to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. "It's December, Mr. Caldwell. The nearest settlement is over 100 miles away. My daughters are 5 years old. You're sending us to our deaths." Caldwell's expression had remained unmoved by her plea. "That's not our intention, but neither is it our responsibility. You've made your choices, Mrs. Ashworth. Now you must live with the consequences." The conversation had ended there, leaving Rebecca to stumble home to her daughters with the impossible task of explaining why they would be leaving the only home the triplets had ever known. Faith, Hope, and Grace had listened to their mother's carefully edited explanation with the solemn attention that children reserve for moments when they sense their world is about to change forever. "Where will we go, Mama?" Hope had asked, her small hand finding Rebecca's with the instinctive need for comfort that characterized her gentle nature. Rebecca had pulled all 3 girls close, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair while fighting back tears that would only frighten them more. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but we'll be together, and that's what matters most." Grace, ever the intuitive one, had looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed far too old for her 5-year-old face. "Are we going to see the Cherokee people, Mama? The ones Papa used to talk to?" The question had startled Rebecca with its perceptiveness. In all her worry about practical matters, food, shelter, survival, she hadn't consciously considered the possibility that their exile might lead them into Cherokee territory. But now, remembering Daniel's dying words about Little Wolf, she wondered if her youngest daughter had somehow sensed something that she herself had missed. "I don't know, Grace," she had answered honestly. "But if we do, we'll try to remember everything Papa taught us about treating people with respect." Now, as dawn broke cold and grey over Millfield Creek on December 20th, 1843, Rebecca Ashworth stood beside a rickety wagon loaded with their meagre possessions, watching her daughters say goodbye to the chickens they had raised from chicks and the garden where they had played countless games of hide-and-seek among the vegetables. The triplets wore their warmest clothes. Wool dresses Rebecca had sewn herself, knitted stockings, and sturdy boots that were already too small, but would have to last until they reached wherever they were going. Jeremiah Caldwell had provided the wagon and a single horse as promised, though both were so old and worn that Rebecca suspected they had been chosen more for their expendability than their utility. The supplies consisted of a bag of cornmeal, some dried beans, a small amount of salt pork, and 2 blankets that would provide little protection against the mountain winter's fury. As the settlement's residents watched from their doorways and windows, some with expressions of guilt and others with obvious relief, Rebecca helped her daughters climb into the wagon bed. Faith, Hope, and Grace huddled together among their few possessions, their identical faces showing the same mixture of fear and determination that Rebecca knew must be reflected in her own features. "Remember," Caldwell called out as Rebecca took up the reins. "You follow the mountain trail south toward the Tennessee border. Don't try to come back, Mrs. Ashworth. You won't be welcome." Rebecca nodded curtly, refusing to give the man the satisfaction of seeing her despair. With a gentle word to the old horse, she guided the wagon toward the trail that would take them away from Millfield Creek forever, into the wilderness where Cherokee war parties roamed and where a widow with 3 small children would face odds that no sane person would willingly choose. As the settlement disappeared behind them, swallowed by the morning mist that clung to the mountain valleys, Rebecca tried to push down the growing certainty that she was leading her daughters to their deaths. The trail ahead was treacherous even in good weather, and with winter storms already beginning to sweep down from the high peaks, they would be racing against time and the elements to find shelter before the mountains claimed their lives. What Rebecca didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that their wagon was already being watched by eyes that had learned to track every movement of white settlers through these disputed lands. Hidden in the forest shadows, Cherokee scouts were reporting their progress to a war chief whose reputation for ruthlessness toward white intruders had earned him the name Howling Wolf, a man whose hatred for the people who had stolen his homeland ran as deep as the mountain roots themselves. The collision between Rebecca Ashworth's desperate flight and Howling Wolf's burning desire for vengeance was inevitable now, set in motion by the cruel calculations of men who had chosen exile over compassion. But in the vast wilderness of the Cherokee Nation, where ancient laws governed the treatment of those who entered tribal lands uninvited, mercy was a currency that had been spent long ago in exchanges written in blood and betrayal. The wagon rolled forward into the gathering storm, carrying a mother and her 3 daughters toward a destiny that none of them could imagine, where the line between enemy and salvation would be decided by the beating of a single Cherokee heart that had forgotten how to forgive. 3 miles above the mountain trail where Rebecca Ashworth's wagon creaked through the morning mist, a figure moved through the forest with the silent precision of a hunting wolf. Howling Wolf, war chief of the last free Cherokee band in these mountains, tracked the white settlers' progress from ridge to ridge, his moccasined feet finding purchase on rocks and roots that would have sent lesser warriors tumbling to their deaths. At 35, Howling Wolf possessed the kind of physical presence that made even his own warriors step aside when he passed. Standing nearly 6.5 feet tall, his muscular frame was marked by the scars of countless battles, a jagged line across his left shoulder from a cavalry saber, burn marks on his forearms from a cabin fire he had set in retaliation for. His sister's murder, and most prominently, a deep furrow along his jaw where a settler's bullet had come within inches of ending his life 3 years earlier. His face was a masterwork of controlled fury, with high cheekbones that spoke of noble Cherokee bloodlines and dark eyes that burned with an intensity that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable under his gaze. His black hair, streaked with premature silver, was pulled back in the traditional warrior's knot and decorated with eagle feathers earned through acts of courage that had become legend among his people. But it was not Howling Wolf's physical presence that made him the most feared Cherokee leader in the Tennessee mountains. It was his absolute, uncompromising hatred for the white invaders who had destroyed his world. Unlike other Cherokee chiefs who had sought accommodation or compromise, Howling Wolf had chosen the path of total war, leading a band of 40 warriors who had sworn blood oaths to drive every white settler from their ancestral lands or die. In the attempt, the source of his rage ran deeper than politics or territorial disputes. 7 years earlier, Howling Wolf had been known by his birth name, Gentle Bear, and had been among the Cherokee leaders who still believed peaceful coexistence with white settlers was possible. He had a wife, Morning Star, whose beauty was celebrated in songs throughout the Cherokee nation, and 2 young sons who showed promise of becoming great warriors themselves. Everything had changed on a October morning in 1836 when Georgia militia, claiming to be enforcing federal removal orders, had attacked his village, while most of the warriors were away on a hunting expedition. The militiamen had shown no mercy to the women, children, and elderly left behind, systematically burning every structure and killing anyone who tried to resist or escape. Howling Wolf had returned from the hunt to find his village destroyed, his wife and sons among the 23 dead, their bodies left unburied for the wolves and carrion birds. In that moment, standing among the ashes of everything he had loved, Gentle Bear had died, and Howling Wolf had been born. A creature of pure vengeance who had sworn on the graves of his family that he would never again show mercy to any white person who dared to enter Cherokee lands. Since that terrible day, Howling Wolf's war band had become the scourge of white settlements throughout the region. They struck without warning, burned cabins and barns, ran off livestock, and killed any settlers who tried to fight back. Unlike other Cherokee groups who often spared women and children, Howling Wolf's warriors showed no such restraint. They had learned from bitter experience that white children grew up to become white soldiers, and white women gave birth to the next generation of invaders. The federal government had placed a bounty of $500 on Howling Wolf's head, an enormous sum that had attracted bounty hunters from as far away as Texas. None had succeeded in claiming the reward, and several had paid for their attempts with their lives. The Cherokee war chief had developed an almost supernatural reputation among both white settlers and his own people, with some claiming he could become invisible at will, and others insisting that bullets simply passed through his body without causing harm. Now, as he shadowed the lone wagon making its way through the morning mist, Howling Wolf felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded violence. Here was another opportunity to strike at the hated white invaders, to send a message that would echo through every settlement from Georgia to Kentucky. The wagon appeared to contain a woman and several children, easy targets that would require minimal effort to eliminate, but something about this particular group of travelers nagged at the war chief's instincts. Most white settlers who dared to travel these trails moved in large, well-armed groups, their wagons forming defensive circles each night, and their men maintaining constant vigilance against Cherokee attacks. This wagon was alone, vulnerable, almost defensively inadequate for the dangerous journey it was attempting. Howling Wolf had survived 7 years of warfare by trusting his instincts, and those instincts were telling him that this situation was not what it appeared to be. He decided to observe longer before striking, following the wagon from a distance while his warriors remained hidden in the forest, ready to attack on his signal. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop toward the freezing point, Rebecca Ashworth guided her exhausted horse off the main trail toward a small clearing where they could make camp for the night. The old animal was clearly struggling with the weight of the wagon and the challenging terrain, and Rebecca knew they would have to rest soon or risk losing their only means of transportation. The triplets had been remarkably patient during their first day of exile, huddled together in the wagon bed and occasionally pointing out interesting sights along the trail. A hawk circling overhead, a deer bounding through the trees, rock formations that resembled familiar objects from their life in Millfield Creek. But Rebecca could see the strain beginning to show in their small faces, the quiet exhaustion that came from spending hours bouncing along rough mountain paths, while trying to process the enormous changes in their lives. "Are we going to sleep outside, Mama?" Faith asked, as Rebecca helped her daughters down from the wagon. The eldest triplet's voice carried a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Sleeping outdoors was an adventure she had never experienced. But the approaching darkness and falling temperature made it clear this would be no comfortable camping trip. "Just for tonight, sweetheart," Rebecca replied, though she knew it would likely be for many nights to come. She had less than $2 in coins hidden in her dress pocket, hardly enough to secure lodging even if they could find an inn willing to accommodate a woman traveling alone with children. Rebecca worked quickly to establish their campsite before full darkness arrived. She unhitched the old horse and tethered it where it could reach a small stream that ran through the clearing, then gathered wood for a fire while the triplets helped arrange their few blankets into sleeping areas. The girls worked with the cheerful efficiency of children who viewed hardship as an interesting challenge rather than a genuine threat to their survival. Hope, ever the nurturing one among the sisters, took charge of organizing their limited food supplies, while Grace entertained them all with elaborate stories about the woodland creatures they had seen during the day. Faith, displaying the practical intelligence that would serve her well in the years to come, had already begun collecting additional firewood and had somehow fashioned a crude shelter using branches and one of their blankets. As the fire crackled to life and their meager dinner of cornbread and dried beans warmed in a battered pot, Rebecca found herself marveling at her daughter's resilience. They had been cast out from the only home they had ever known, were facing an uncertain future in hostile wilderness, and yet they maintained the fundamental optimism that seemed to be their birthright. "Mama," Grace said as they huddled around the fire, "do you think Papa is watching us from heaven?" The question caught Rebecca off guard, bringing tears to her eyes that she quickly wiped away before her daughters could see them. "I'm sure he is, sweetheart, and I know he's proud of how brave you girls are being. He would have liked this," Faith added with characteristic directness. "Papa always said we should learn to live in the woods like the Cherokee people do." The mention of Daniel's Cherokee friends sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had been trying not to think about the possibility of encountering Cherokee war parties during their journey, but Faith's innocent comment reminded her that they were now traveling through territory where such encounters were not just possible, but likely. As the girls settled into their makeshift beds, Rebecca maintained the fire and kept watch over their small camp. The forest around them was alive with sounds, owls calling to each other across the darkness, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch that might have been caused by wind or something larger. What Rebecca didn't know was that one of those sounds was definitely caused by something larger. Howling Wolf had positioned himself less than 50 yards from their campsite, close enough to hear their conversations and observe their every movement. The Cherokee war chief had listened to the woman and her daughters with growing confusion, their words challenging assumptions he had made about their journey. These were not settlers moving into Cherokee territory to claim land or establish a new homestead. They were refugees cast out from their own community and struggling to survive in the wilderness. The woman showed no signs of the arrogance or entitlement that characterized most white invaders. Instead, she displayed the careful behavior of someone who understood she was in hostile territory and was trying to avoid confrontation. More intriguingly, the children had mentioned their father's friendship with Cherokee people, suggesting a level of respect and understanding that was rare among white settlers. Howling Wolf found himself remembering Little Wolf, a warrior from his own band who had occasionally traded with a white blacksmith near Millfield Creek. Little Wolf had spoken respectfully of the blacksmith, describing him as a man who learned Cherokee words and treated native people as equals rather than inferiors. Could this be the family of that same blacksmith? If so, the situation became considerably more complicated than a simple raid on traveling settlers. Little Wolf was one of Howling Wolf's most trusted warriors, and his judgment on such matters carried significant weight within the warband. As the hours passed and the temperature continued to drop, Howling Wolf found himself faced with an unexpected moral dilemma. Everything in his training and experience told him to strike swiftly and without mercy. These were white invaders in Cherokee territory, and the appropriate response was death. But something about this particular family resonated with memories he had tried to bury, along with his former identity as Gentle Bear. The woman's gentle care for her children reminded him painfully of Morning Star tending to their sons. The children's innocent chatter and obvious trust in their mother's ability to protect them echoed his own boys' voices from 7 years ago. Most disturbing of all, the family's vulnerability and obvious desperation mirrored the helplessness his own people had felt when forced from their homes by white soldiers and Georgia militia. Was this how his wife and children had spent their final night, huddled around a small fire, trying to stay warm while death approached through the darkness? The parallel was uncomfortable enough to make even Howling Wolf question the justice of what he was planning. But justice, he reminded himself, was not about individual circumstances or personal sympathies. Justice was about the systematic destruction of his people, the theft of their lands, the murder of their families. This woman might be a victim of her own people's cruelty, but she was still a white person in Cherokee territory, and Cherokee law was clear on how such situations should be resolved. As dawn approached and the family began stirring around their dying fire, Howling Wolf made his decision. He would take them captive rather than killing them immediately, bringing them back to his main camp where the band's council could determine their fate. This would satisfy Cherokee law while allowing time to learn more about their true circumstances and intentions. The decision was tactically sound, but Howling Wolf couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to change in his carefully ordered world of absolutes. For 7 years, he had lived by the simple principle that all white people deserved death for the crimes committed against the Cherokee nation. Now, watching a mother struggle to wake her sleeping daughters and prepare for another day of uncertain travel, he found that principle under assault by emotions he had thought long dead. Rebecca was packing their few possessions back into the wagon when she became aware of being watched. It was nothing she could point to specifically, no sound, no movement visible in the forest around their clearing, but every instinct honed by years of frontier living was screaming that they were no longer alone. "Girls," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice calm and natural, "I want you to climb into the wagon now, quickly, but don't run. Faith, hope, and grace responded to the subtle urgency in their mother's tone, with the immediate obedience that children develop when they understand their survival depends on following instructions without question. They gathered their blankets and scrambled into the wagon bed, their identical faces showing the alert tension of young animals sensing danger. Rebecca was reaching for the rifle Daniel had insisted she learn to use, when the forest around their campsite suddenly came alive. With Cherokee warriors, they emerged from concealment with such silent precision that they seemed to materialize from the morning mist itself, painted figures in buckskin and feathers, carrying weapons that ranged from traditional bows to captured army rifles. At their head stood the most imposing man Rebecca had ever seen, a Cherokee warrior whose very presence seemed to radiate controlled violence, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like prey being evaluated by a predator, while his hand rested casually on the handle of a tomahawk that had clearly seen considerable use. "You are in Cherokee territory," Howling, Wolf said in heavily accented but clear English, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "You will come with us now." Rebecca's hand was still inches from her rifle when 3 arrow points appeared at her throat, held by warriors who had moved with supernatural speed and silence. The message was unmistakably clear. Any attempt at resistance would result in immediate death. "Please," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "My daughters are just children. Whatever you plan to do to me, please let them go." Howling Wolf studied the woman's face, noting the courage it took to bargain for her children's lives, even when facing her own death. It was exactly what a Cherokee mother would have done in similar circumstances, and the recognition of this universal parental instinct stirred uncomfortable memories of his own family's final moments. "No one will be harmed if you do as you are told," he said finally, though he wasn't entirely sure he could keep that promise. Cherokee law regarding white invaders was strict and unforgiving, and his own warriors expected their war chief to uphold that law regardless of personal feelings. As the warriors surrounded the wagon and began leading it deeper into Cherokee territory, Rebecca pulled her daughters close and whispered the only reassurance she could offer. "Remember what Papa taught us about the Cherokee people. They are not savages. They have laws and honor just like we do." But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca couldn't forget the stories that had terrified her community for months. Tales of Cherokee raids that left no survivors, of war parties that showed no mercy to women and children. Whatever lay ahead, in the Cherokee stronghold where they were being taken, she knew their survival would depend on factors far beyond her control. The wagon rolled deeper into the mountains, carrying its cargo of captives toward a confrontation that would test everything both cultures believed about justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption in a world torn apart by hatred and fear. The Cherokee war camp lay concealed in a natural amphitheater, carved into the mountainside by centuries of wind and water, its location so perfectly hidden that even seasoned trackers could pass within 100 yards and never suspect its existence. Accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be defended by a handful of warriors, the stronghold had become the last refuge of Cherokee fighters who refused to surrender their homeland to white invaders. As Howling Wolf's war party emerged from the canyon's shadowy mouth, leading their captives into the heart of Cherokee resistance, Rebecca Ashworth found herself entering a world that challenged every assumption she had ever held about native life. This was not the primitive encampment described in settler stories, but a sophisticated military operation that had been planned and executed with the precision of a West Point graduate. The camp was arranged in concentric circles, with the outermost ring consisting of carefully positioned sentries and defensive works that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The second ring contained the warriors' lodges, traditional structures that had been modified with firing ports and reinforced walls capable of withstanding rifle fire. At the center of the complex stood the council lodge, an impressive structure, large enough to house gatherings of the entire war band, but it was the people themselves who truly shocked Rebecca. These were not the half-naked savages of frontier mythology, but disciplined fighters who moved with the quiet confidence of professional soldiers. Many wore combinations of traditional Cherokee dress and captured military equipment, buckskin shirts adorned with eagle feathers alongside stolen cavalry sabers, moccasins paired with army-issue cartridge belts, war paint applied over faces that showed the intelligence and determination of men fighting for their homeland's survival. The arrival of white captives caused an immediate stir throughout the camp. Warriors emerged from their lodges to watch the procession, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and barely contained hostility. Women and children gathered in doorways, their eyes reflecting the pain of families torn apart by 7 years of relentless warfare. Even the camp dogs seemed to sense the tension, their hackles raised as they followed the wagon with suspicious growls. Faith, Hope, and Grace huddled together in the wagon bed, their identical faces pale with fear, but their eyes bright with the resilient curiosity of children, encountering something entirely outside their experience. Despite their terror, they were fascinated by the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells of the Cherokee stronghold, the smoke from cooking fires that carried the scent of unfamiliar spices, the rhythmic sound of women working hides with bone, scrapers, the musical quality of Cherokee voices speaking in their ancient tongue. "Mama," Hope whispered, her voice barely audible above the creak of wagon wheels. "They're not what the stories said they would be." Rebecca squeezed her daughter's hand, recognizing the same observation that was reshaping her own understanding of the situation. The Cherokee camp showed clear evidence of organization, discipline, and cultural sophistication that contradicted everything she had been taught about native peoples. These were not mindless savages driven by bloodlust, but human beings fighting a desperate war for their survival. As evening descended upon the hidden stronghold, the entire war band gathered around the great council fire that had been lit in the center of the camp. This was more than a military briefing. It was a sacred ceremony that connected the living warriors to their ancestors and to the land they had sworn to defend. The flames cast dancing shadows across painted faces, while the smoke carried prayers to the spirit world, seeking guidance for the momentous decision that lay before them. Howling Wolf sat in the place of honor, his imposing figure draped in a buffalo robe that had been painted with symbols representing his victories over white soldiers. To his right sat Little Wolf, the warrior who had known Daniel Ashworth and whose testimony would prove crucial in determining the captive's fate. To his left sat Screaming Eagle, an elderly war chief whose scarred face and missing left eye bore witness to decades of conflict with white invaders. The captives had been placed at the edge of the circle, close enough to observe the proceedings, but far enough to be guarded by warriors whose loyalty to Cherokee law was absolute. Rebecca kept her daughters close, one arm around each of the younger girls, while Faith pressed against her other side, all 4 of them trying to make sense of the ceremony unfolding before them. The council began with traditional rituals, the passing of the sacred pipe, invocations to the Great Spirit, and recitations of Cherokee history that stretched back centuries before the first white man had set foot on the continent. But gradually the focus shifted to more immediate concerns, the war against white settlers, recent victories and defeats, and most importantly, the proper treatment of white captives found in Cherokee territory. Howling Wolf rose to address the council, his voice carrying easily across the gathering as he spoke in the Cherokee language. Though Rebecca couldn't understand his words, the passion in his tone and the reactions of his listeners made it clear that he was recounting the circumstances of their capture and arguing for a specific course of action. When the war chief finished speaking, other voices joined the debate. Some warriors stood to demand immediate execution of the white captives, their arguments punctuated by gestures towards scars and wounds that testified to their own suffering. At white hands, others spoke more moderately, their words carrying the weight of tribal tradition and the complex laws that governed Cherokee treatment of prisoners. It was Little Wolf who finally stood to speak for the captives, his testimony carrying special weight because of his personal knowledge of Daniel Ashworth. The warrior spoke at length about his dealings with the white blacksmith, describing a man who had shown respect for Cherokee customs and had treated native people as equals rather than inferiors. "The metal worker learned our words," Little Wolf said, switching to English so the captives could understand his testimony. He spoke of his woman and small ones with pride. He said Cherokee people were wise, that white men could learn from our ways if they chose to listen instead of fighting. The warrior's words sent a ripple of surprised murmurs through the council. For a white man to publicly express admiration for Cherokee culture was almost unheard of in their experience, and several of the more moderate voices began to speak in support of showing mercy to Daniel's family. But Screaming Eagle, whose hatred for white settlers ran as deep as Howling Wolf's own, rose to counter Little Wolf's testimony with arguments that struck at the heart of Cherokee survival. "One white man who spoke kind words cannot balance the deaths of our children," the elderly war chief declared, his voice cracking with emotion. "I have buried 3 sons killed by white soldiers. My granddaughter was taken by white slavers, and never seen again. How many Cherokee families must die to pay for the kindness shown to one white blacksmith?" The question hung in the night air like smoke from the council fire, and Rebecca felt her heart sink as she realized the weight of history that her family was being measured against. These men had lost everything to white expansion: their land, their families, their entire way of life. How could she expect them to show mercy to white captives simply because her dead husband had treated them with respect? It was at this moment of deepest despair that an unexpected voice joined the council. Debate. Grace, the youngest of the triplets, had been listening intently to the Cherokee words, even though she couldn't understand them, and something in the rhythm and emotion of the speeches had resonated with her sensitive nature. Standing up despite her mother's restraining hand, the 5-year-old girl walked toward the council fire with the fearless curiosity that had always characterized her personality. The gathering fell silent as this small white child approached the sacred flames, her golden hair catching the firelight as she looked directly at Howling Wolf with eyes that held no trace of fear. "You're sad," Grace said simply, her child's voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "You're sad like Mama was when Papa went to heaven." The directness of her observation struck the Cherokee warriors like a physical blow. Here was a white child who had recognized the pain behind their anger, who had seen through their fierce exterior to the grief that drove their hatred of her people. Howling Wolf stared down at the small girl, his composure shaken by her innocent perception. In her blue eyes, he saw something he had forgotten existed: the ability to recognize shared humanity across the barriers of race and culture. It was a gift that children possessed naturally, but that adults often lost in the harsh realities of war and survival. "My papa said Cherokee people were brave and wise," Grace continued, unaware of the profound impact her words were having on the council. "He said they loved their children and their land just like we do. He said maybe someday white people and Cherokee people could be friends again." Faith and hope, inspired by their sister's courage, rose to join her beside the council fire. The 3 identical girls stood together in the firelight, their innocent presence a stark contrast to the war-painted warriors who surrounded them. "Our papa is dead," Faith said, with her characteristic directness, and the white people in our town made us leave because they were afraid of Cherokee people. They said Cherokee people were bad, but Papa said that wasn't true. Hope, ever the peacemaker, added her own voice to her sister's testimony. We don't want to fight anybody. We just want to find a place where we can live and not be afraid. The triplets' words created a profound silence in the Cherokee Council as hardened warriors struggled to process what they had just witnessed. These white children, who should have been crying in terror or begging for their lives, had instead offered sympathy for Cherokee suffering and testimony to their father's respect for Cherokee people. Screaming Eagle, whose argument for execution had seemed unassailable just moments before, found himself staring at the three girls with an expression of confusion and growing doubt. How could he advocate for the deaths of children who spoke of friendship and understanding? How could Cherokee law demand the execution of innocents who had already been victimized by their own people's prejudice? It was then that another voice joined the council debate, one that carried even greater authority than the war chiefs themselves. Grandmother Willow, the eldest woman in the war band and the keeper of Cherokee traditional law, emerged from her lodge and walked slowly toward the council fire. At nearly 70 years old, Grandmother Willow was a living link to Cherokee history, a woman who had witnessed the first treaties with white men and had survived the systematic destruction of her people's way of life. Her word carried the weight of generations, and even Howling Wolf showed her the deference due to an elder whose wisdom was considered sacred. The old woman studied the white captives with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of nations, her weathered face reflecting the accumulated pain and wisdom of a lifetime spent watching her people struggle for survival. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the authority of Cherokee law and the compassion of a grandmother who had outlived most of her own children. I have listened to the words of warriors who speak of death and revenge, she said in Cherokee. Her words then translated by Little Wolf for the captives' benefit. I have heard the arguments for justice and the demands for blood to balance blood. These are the words of men whose hearts are filled with righteous anger. She paused, turning her ancient gaze toward the triplets who stood bravely beside the council fire. But I have also heard the words of children who speak of their father's respect for our people. I have seen white young ones who show courage in the face of death and compassion for Cherokee suffering. These are not the voices of enemies but of human beings who carry their father's wisdom in their hearts. Grandmother Willow's words carried immense weight within Cherokee culture, where elders were revered as the guardians of traditional wisdom and the interpreters of ancient law. Her intervention shifted the entire tone of the council debate, opening space for arguments that had seemed impossible just moments before. Cherokee law speaks of justice, she continued, but it also speaks of mercy. Our ancestors taught that the strong must protect the weak, that warriors must show honor even to their enemies. These white people have been cast out by their own kind, abandoned to die in our mountains. They are not invaders seeking to steal our land. They are refugees seeking sanctuary from their own people's cruelty. The old woman's logic was difficult to argue against, especially when combined with the powerful testimony of the triplets themselves. Even the most hardened warriors were beginning to waver in their demand for immediate execution, recognizing that this situation was unlike any they had encountered before. But Howling Wolf was not yet ready to abandon the principles that had guided him through 7 years of warfare against white settlers. Rising to his full, imposing height, the war chief addressed both the council and the captives with words that would determine whether Rebecca Ashworth and her daughters would live to see another sunrise. Grandmother Willow speaks wisdom that comes from many seasons of life, he said formally, his English precise despite his accent. But I must speak for the dead, for Morning Star and my sons, for all the Cherokee families destroyed by white. Hatred. How can we show mercy to the children of those who showed no mercy to ours? The question hung in the night air like a challenge to the very foundations of Cherokee law and tradition. The council fire crackled and sparked, its flames illuminating faces marked by years of war and loss, as the fate of 4 white lives balanced on the edge of a decision that would define the soul of Cherokee resistance. In that moment of supreme tension, with death or salvation hanging in the balance, the triplets demonstrated once again the extraordinary courage that had brought them safely through so many dangers. Instead of cowering in fear or pleading for their lives, they stepped forward together and offered something that no Cherokee warrior had expected from white captives: their own understanding of loss and their willingness to share in Cherokee grief. The council fire burned lower as the night deepened, but the debate that would determine the captives' fate was far from over. Forces of justice and mercy, tradition and compassion, hatred and hope were all engaged in a struggle that would test the very soul of Cherokee honor. As dawn broke over the Cherokee stronghold, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Howling Wolf emerged from his lodge with a decision that would surprise both his warriors and his captives. The night-long council had ended without resolution, the voices of justice and mercy locked in a stalemate that Cherokee law could not easily resolve. But the war chief had found inspiration in an ancient tradition that offered a path forward, one that would test not just the captives' worthiness to live, but the Cherokee people's capacity for wisdom beyond vengeance. "There is an old way," Howling Wolf announced to the assembled warband, his voice carrying the authority of generations of Cherokee leaders. When the council cannot decide between life and death, when the spirits themselves seem divided, there is a test that can reveal the truth hidden in human hearts. Grandmother Willow nodded slowly, recognizing the ancient ritual he was invoking. The test of hearts was older than Cherokee memory, a sacred challenge that had been used in the earliest days when the people first walked the earth. It required captives to prove their worthiness not through combat or submission, but through acts that demonstrated the strength of their spirit and the purity of their intentions. Rebecca felt her stomach clench with fear as she watched the Cherokee warriors gather in a circle around her family. Whatever this test involved, she knew their lives hung in the balance, but she also recognized something in Howling Wolf's demeanor that gave her hope. This was not the stance of a man preparing for execution, but of a leader seeking a different kind of truth. "The white woman and her daughters will live among us for 7 sons, Howling Wolf declared, switching to English so Rebecca could understand the terms of their trial. "They will work beside our women, learn our ways, share our burdens. If at the end of this time they have proven themselves worthy of Cherokee mercy, they will be granted their lives and safe passage from our territory." The terms of the test were unlike anything Rebecca had expected. Instead of facing immediate death or torture, they were being offered a chance to demonstrate their character through daily interaction with their captors. It was both more hopeful and more terrifying than she had anticipated. 7 days, too, proved that white people could deserve Cherokee compassion. Within hours of Howling Wolf's announcement, Rebecca and her daughters found themselves integrated into the daily life of the Cherokee war camp in ways that challenged every assumption. They had held about Native society. They were assigned to work alongside Cherokee women whose own stories of loss and survival rivaled anything Rebecca had experienced in her widowed existence. Morningstar's sister, a woman whose name reflected both her beauty and her tragedy, became their primary guide into Cherokee domestic life. She was approximately Rebecca's age, with intelligent dark eyes and prematurely gray hair that spoke of suffering beyond her years. Her husband and 2 children had been killed during the same militia raid that had claimed Howling Wolf's family, and she now devoted herself to caring for the warband's orphaned children with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who had learned that love and loss were inseparable. "Your daughters must learn to be useful," Morningstar's sister explained in halting English as she showed Rebecca how to prepare the cornmeal that formed the basis of Cherokee nutrition. "Cherokee children work from the time they can walk. No one survives in the mountains without everyone contributing." The lesson was delivered without cruelty, but with the practical directness of someone who understood that survival in Cherokee society depended on everyone pulling their own weight. Rebecca watched as Faith, Hope, and Grace were gently but firmly guided into age-appropriate tasks, gathering firewood, helping with food preparation, and learning to weave baskets from river reeds. What struck Rebecca most profoundly was how naturally her daughters adapted to Cherokee life. Faith's natural leadership abilities found expression in organizing the other children's work, while Hope's nurturing instincts made her a favorite among the Cherokee mothers who appreciated her gentle help with their own children. Grace, with her dreamy creativity, proved surprisingly adept at the intricate beadwork that decorated Cherokee clothing and ceremonial items. But it was the Cherokee children themselves who provided the most revealing glimpse into the humanity that warfare had obscured. These were not the savage offspring of bloodthirsty warriors that settler stories described, but normal children dealing with the trauma of displacement and loss in remarkably resilient ways. Little Fox, a Cherokee boy of perhaps 8, whose father had died fighting white soldiers, initially viewed the white captives with deep suspicion, but within days he was teaching Faith Cherokee words for different types of birds and competing with her to see who could climb trees more skillfully. Singing Bird, a girl Hope's age who had lost her mother to settler violence, found comfort in the triplet's gentle nature and began sharing Cherokee children's games that transcended language barriers. It was Grace's assignment to help in the Cherokee Healing Lodge that provided the most dramatic evidence of the cultural exchange taking place within the war camp. Walks with Spirits, the band's medicine woman, was initially skeptical about accepting help from a white child, but Grace's intuitive understanding of plants and their properties quickly won her respect. "This small one has the gift," Walks with Spirits observed to Morningstar's sister as they watched Grace carefully sort medicinal herbs with an accuracy that suggested natural ability rather than learned knowledge. Her spirit speaks to the plant people in ways that cannot be taught. The medicine woman began teaching Grace Cherokee healing traditions that had been passed down through generations of healers, knowledge that included not just the practical application of herbal remedies, but the spiritual beliefs that made Cherokee medicine effective. Grace absorbed these lessons with the eager intelligence of a child who had found her true calling. More importantly, Grace began contributing her own knowledge to Cherokee healing practices. Her mother had taught her about European herbal remedies, and her natural intuition about plant medicine allowed her to suggest combinations and applications that Walks with Spirits had never considered. When a Cherokee warrior returned to camp with the infected arrow wound that was not responding to traditional treatments, it was Grace who suggested combining willow bark tea with a poultice made from wild garlic and honey, a remedy that proved remarkably effective at fighting the infection. The success of this hybrid healing approach created ripples of respect throughout the Cherokee community. The test's most crucial moment came on the 5th day, when news arrived that would challenge every Cherokee in the warband and threaten to destroy the fragile progress that had been made toward understanding. A Cherokee scout arrived at dawn with reports that a white military patrol was approaching the valley, following tracks that might lead them to the hidden stronghold. The soldiers were led by Colonel James Harrison, a man whose reputation for brutality toward Cherokee civilians was legendary throughout the region. If Harrison's patrol discovered the war camp's location, the result would be a massacre that would leave no Cherokee survivors. The news sent shockwaves through the warband. Some warriors immediately demanded that the white captives be executed to prevent them from potentially aiding the approaching soldiers. Others argued for immediate evacuation of the camp, abandoning their carefully prepared defensive positions to avoid discovery. It was in this moment of crisis that Rebecca Ashworth made a decision that would define not just her family's fate, but the future relationship between her daughters and the Cherokee people who had become their unlikely teachers. "I know Colonel Harrison," Rebecca said quietly when the debate reached its peak. "He served with my husband during the Mexican War. If you allow me to speak with him, I may be able to convince him that this valley contains nothing worth his attention." The offer was met with stunned silence. Here was a white captive volunteering to risk her own life to protect her Cherokee captors, a demonstration of loyalty that challenged everything the warriors believed about white duplicity and selfishness. Howling, Wolf studied Rebecca's face with the intensity of a man trying to read the contents of another person's soul. "Why would you do this? If you betray us to the soldiers, you and your daughters would be free. You could return to the white world and leave Cherokee troubles behind." Rebecca's answer came from a place of understanding that had developed gradually over 5 days of living among people she had been taught to view as enemies. "Because I've learned that Cherokee people love their children just as fiercely as I love mine. Because my daughters have found friends and teachers here who have shown them kindness when their own people showed them only cruelty. Because sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's safe." What followed was one of the most elaborate and dangerous deceptions ever attempted in the Cherokee resistance to white expansion. Working together, Rebecca and the Cherokee warriors created a scenario designed to convince Colonel Harrison that the valley contained nothing more than a lone white widow struggling to survive in the wilderness. The war camp was evacuated within hours, with warriors and their families moving to hidden caves deeper in the mountains, while a small group remained. To create the illusion of an abandoned campsite, Rebecca's wagon was repositioned to suggest she had been living alone in the valley for weeks, while evidence of Cherokee presence was carefully erased or disguised. The triplets, understanding that their lives and the lives of their Cherokee friends depended on their performance, prepared to play the roles of frightened children, grateful to be rescued by white soldiers. It was a demanding act for 5-year-olds, requiring them to hide their newfound affection for Cherokee culture and their anger at their own people's treatment of them. When Colonel Harrison's patrol entered the valley 2 days later, they found exactly what Rebecca and her Cherokee allies had prepared them to find: a desperate white widow with 3 young daughters struggling to survive after becoming lost in Cherokee territory. The deception was so complete that Harrison never suspected the truth. "Mrs. Ashworth," the colonel said with the false gallantry of a man who viewed women as helpless creatures requiring masculine protection, "Providence has smiled upon you. Another few days in this wilderness, and you might never have been found." Rebecca played her part perfectly, expressing gratitude for the rescue while carefully steering Harrison's attention away from any evidence that might suggest Cherokee presence in the area. The triplets, drawing on their natural intelligence and their mother's coaching, supported the deception with convincing performances as traumatized children eager to return to civilization. But as Colonel Harrison's patrol prepared to escort them from the valley, Rebecca faced the most difficult decision of her life. The Cherokee people had trusted her with their lives, and she had kept that trust. But now she had to choose between the safety of returning to white society and loyalty to people who had shown her family more genuine kindness than their own community had ever offered. The decision she made in that moment would determine not just her family's future, but whether the bridge of understanding built between two cultures could survive the forces trying to tear it apart. As the military patrol rode out of the valley, carrying what appeared to be rescued white settlers back to safety, the mountains held their breath, waiting to see whether mercy and understanding could triumph over centuries of hatred and mistrust. The test was far from over, and its outcome would reshape the hearts of everyone involved in ways that none of them could yet imagine. 3 miles from the Cherokee stronghold, as Colonel Harrison's patrol made camp for the night, Rebecca Ashworth faced the most agonizing decision of her life. The military escort that was supposedly rescuing her family from Cherokee territory had no idea they were being manipulated by the very people they sought to destroy. But Rebecca knew that her next choice would determine not just her family's future, but the survival of an entire Cherokee community that had shown her more genuine compassion than her own people ever had. Faith, hope, and grace slept fitfully in their bedrolls near the soldiers' campfire, exhausted by the emotional strain of maintaining their deception throughout the day. To the casual observer, they appeared to be traumatized children, grateful for rescue from savage captivity. Only Rebecca could see the truth in their faces, the genuine grief at being separated from Cherokee friends who had become like family, the confusion at having to pretend hatred for people they had grown to love. Colonel Harrison sat by the fire, regaling his men with stories of Cherokee atrocities while cleaning his service revolver with the mechanical precision of a career soldier. He was a man in his 50s, with grey whiskers and cold blue eyes that had seen too much warfare to retain any illusions about the nobility of his profession. His reputation for ruthlessness toward Cherokee civilians was well earned, and Rebecca knew that if he discovered the truth about their week in the war camp, the consequences would be swift and brutal. "Mrs. Ashworth," the colonel said, turning his attention to Rebecca with the patronizing concern that characterized his attitude toward women. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. The savages didn't harm you or your daughters in any way, did they?" The question carried implications that made Rebecca's skin crawl, but she forced herself to maintain the role of grateful victim. "No, Colonel. We were fortunate. They seemed more interested in using us as bargaining chips than other purposes." Harrison nodded with satisfaction, apparently pleased that white womanhood had been preserved intact. "Good. The Cherokee are becoming more calculating in their brutality. Time was, they would have killed you outright or worse. Now they're learning to use captives as leverage in their war against civilization." Rebecca bit her tongue to prevent herself from defending the Cherokee people who had shown her family nothing but kindness and respect. The irony was bitter. Her own white community had cast her and her daughters out to die, while Cherokee warriors had risked their lives to protect them from this very man who claimed to be their rescuer. As the camp settled into sleep, Rebecca made her decision. She would not betray the Cherokee location to Colonel Harrison, but neither could she return to a white society that had already rejected her family once. There had to be a third option, a path that honored both her debt to the Cherokee people and her responsibility to her daughter's future. In the darkest hour before dawn, when the sentries were fighting sleep and the camp lay wrapped in the deep quiet of mountain wilderness, Rebecca Ashworth executed a plan that would have made Cherokee warriors proud of her cunning and courage. Working with the silent precision she had learned during her week in the war camp, she gathered her daughters and their few possessions, then led them away from the military encampment into the forest darkness. The escape required every skill she had acquired during her time with the Cherokee, moving silently through underbrush, reading the night sky for direction, following animal trails that white soldiers would never notice. Faith, hope, and grace followed their mother without question, their own Cherokee training allowing them to move through the darkness with confidence that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. By sunrise, they were 10 miles from Harrison's camp and moving deeper into Cherokee territory along paths that only native guides could follow. Rebecca knew that the colonel would assume they had been recaptured by Cherokee warriors, an assumption that would actually protect the war band by directing military attention away from their actual location. But Rebecca's plan went far beyond simple escape. During her week among the Cherokee, she had learned about other white families who had found refuge in Cherokee communities throughout the mountains, traders, missionaries, and settlers who had earned native trust through genuine respect and fair dealing. These people lived in a middle world between white and Cherokee society, serving as interpreters, mediators, and bridges between cultures that seemed destined for eternal conflict. It was toward one of these unique communities that Rebecca now led her daughters, following directions that Morningstar's sister had quietly shared during their work together in the Healing Lodge. If such a place truly existed, it might offer the Ashworth family something that neither white nor Cherokee society could provide alone, a chance to belong somewhere without sacrificing the wisdom they had gained from both cultures. 3 days of difficult travel through increasingly remote mountain terrain brought Rebecca and her daughters to a site that challenged everything they thought they knew about the rigid boundaries between white and Cherokee society. Hidden in a valley so remote that it appeared on no government maps, they discovered a thriving community where the impossible had become everyday reality, white and Cherokee families living together in genuine harmony. The settlement was unlike anything Rebecca had ever imagined. Cherokee lodges stood alongside log cabins, with children of both races playing together in common areas while their parents worked side by side in fields and workshops. White women and Cherokee women shared domestic tasks, trading knowledge about everything from herbal medicine to food preservation. Cherokee warriors and white men collaborated on hunting expeditions and defensive preparations, their partnership based on mutual respect rather than the uneasy alliances that characterized most white native interactions. At the heart of this remarkable community was a man whose story embodied the possibility of genuine reconciliation between two worlds. Thomas Hartwell was a former missionary who had arrived in Cherokee territory 15 years earlier, intent on converting native people to Christianity. Instead, he had found himself converted to a deeper understanding of Cherokee spirituality, while maintaining his own faith. His Cherokee wife, Singing Water, was a woman of such wisdom and dignity that she had become a leader in both Cherokee and white aspects of the community. Every family here has a story of rejection by their own people, Thomas explained to Rebecca as he showed her family around the settlement. Cherokee families who refused to walk the Trail of Tears, white families who stood up for Cherokee rights, mixed-blood children who belonged fully to neither world. We've created something new here, not white society or Cherokee society, but human society. The concept was revolutionary in 1843 America, where racial boundaries were considered divinely ordained and immutable. Yet here was living proof that those boundaries could be transcended through genuine respect, shared hardship, and the simple recognition that all people wanted the same basic things: safety for their families, meaningful work, and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Faith, hope, and grace adapted to their new environment with the remarkable resilience that had carried them through every challenge they had faced. Within days, they were attending the community's unique school, where Cherokee and white children learned both English and Cherokee languages, both European and native history, both Christian and Cherokee spiritual traditions. The education they received was unlike anything available in either white or Cherokee society alone, a synthesis of knowledge that prepared them to navigate multiple worlds with confidence and understanding. But even in this haven of interracial harmony, the larger conflict between white expansion and Cherokee resistance cast a shadow that could not be ignored. News arrived regularly of military campaigns, Cherokee raids, and the inexorable pressure of white settlement that was crushing traditional native society throughout the Southeast. The residents of the Valley of Two Peoples knew that their unique experiment in racial cooperation existed on borrowed time. The crisis came when a Cherokee runner arrived with devastating news from Howling Wolf's warband. Colonel Harrison, frustrated by the mysterious disappearance of the Ashworth family, had begun a systematic campaign of retaliation against Cherokee communities throughout the region. Villages were being burned, Cherokee civilians were being killed or captured, and the pressure was mounting for a final military solution to what white authorities called the Cherokee problem. Most immediately threatening was Harrison's plan to attack the Cherokee Winter Gathering, a sacred ceremony that brought together scattered bands from across the region for spiritual renewal and cultural preservation. The gathering was scheduled to take place in just 2 weeks, and intelligence suggested that Harrison intended to surround the ceremonial grounds and massacre every Cherokee present, including women, children, and elderly people who posed no military threat to white settlements. The news hit the Valley of Two Peoples like a physical blow. Many residents had relatives who would be attending the winter gathering, and the prospect of wholesale slaughter of Cherokee civilians violated every principle the community stood for. But more than personal concerns were at stake. If Harrison succeeded in destroying the winter gathering, he would effectively end Cherokee resistance in the region and open the way for complete white domination of the mountains. Thomas Hartwell called an emergency council meeting that brought together both Cherokee and white residents of the valley to discuss their response to the crisis. The debate that followed revealed the complex loyalties and difficult choices that defined life in their unique community. Some argued for neutrality, insisting that the valley's survival depended on avoiding involvement in the larger conflict between white military forces and Cherokee resistance. Others demanded immediate action to warn the Cherokee bands and help them prepare defenses against Harrison's planned attack. A few even suggested that the valley's white residents should approach military authorities and attempt to prevent the massacre through official channels. But it was Rebecca Ashworth who proposed the most radical solution, one that would require unprecedented courage from everyone involved and would forever change the relationship between her family and both white and Cherokee society. Rebecca's proposal was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its potential consequences. She suggested that the Valley of Two Peoples should serve as the location for the Cherokee Winter Gathering, using their unique community as both a sanctuary and a symbol of what peaceful coexistence between the races could achieve. Colonel Harrison expects to find scattered Cherokee bands hiding in remote canyons and caves, Rebecca explained to the assembled council. He doesn't know this valley exists, and he certainly doesn't know about our community here. If we can convince the Cherokee leaders to hold their gathering in our valley, we can provide protection while demonstrating to both sides that white and Cherokee people can live together in peace. The plan had numerous advantages. The valley's hidden location would make it difficult for military forces to find or attack. The presence of white families would complicate any military action, as even the most ruthless commanders hesitated to attack settlements containing white women and children. Most importantly, the winter gathering could serve as a showcase for the possibility of racial reconciliation, providing a powerful counter-narrative to the military's claims that Cherokee people were inherently savage and violent. But the risks were enormous. If Harrison discovered the valley's location, the entire community would be branded as traitors to their race and face the same fate as the Cherokee people they were protecting. Every white resident would be committing treason in the eyes of federal authorities, while Cherokee participants would be risking their lives on the promise of protection from people they had little reason to trust. The debate continued through the night, with passionate arguments on all sides. Some community members threatened to leave the valley rather than participate in such a dangerous scheme. Others argued that their unique experiment in racial cooperation would be meaningless if they failed to act when Cherokee lives were at stake. It was Thomas Hartwell who finally called for a formal vote, and the result was closer than Rebecca had hoped. By a margin of just 3 votes, the community agreed to invite the Cherokee Winter Gathering to take place in the Valley of Two Peoples, gambling their own survival on the possibility that their example of peaceful coexistence might provide a path forward in a conflict that seemed destined to end in genocide. As runners were dispatched to carry the invitation to Cherokee leaders throughout the region, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her family to this moment, cast out by white society for no crime other than their husband's respect for Cherokee people. They had found sanctuary among the very people they had been taught to fear. Now they were risking everything they had gained to protect a culture that had shown them more genuine Christian charity than any white church ever had. The winter gathering would be more than a Cherokee ceremony. It would be a test of whether understanding could triumph over hatred, whether mercy could overcome vengeance, and whether two peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies could find a way to share the same land in peace. The outcome would determine not just the fate of the Cherokee people, but the moral character of a nation that claimed to be founded on principles of justice and human dignity. The winter of 1844 arrived early in the Tennessee mountains, bringing with it snows that painted the Valley of Two Peoples in crystalline beauty, while concealing the most extraordinary gathering in Cherokee history. Word of the valley's offer had spread through Cherokee communities like wildfire, and the response had exceeded everyone's most optimistic expectations. Warriors, chiefs, medicine men, and entire families began arriving in secret, creating an assembly that represented not just Howling Wolf's resistance band, but Cherokee people from across the entire southeastern region. By the first week of December, over 300 Cherokee people had gathered in the hidden valley, transforming the small integrated community into a temporary city that buzzed with languages, traditions, and stories from dozens of different bands and clans. The logistics of housing, feeding, and organizing such a massive gathering would have challenged any community, but the Valley of Two Peoples rose to the occasion with remarkable efficiency and grace. Thomas Hartwell and Singing Water had worked tirelessly to coordinate the arrangements, but it was Rebecca Ashworth who emerged as an unexpected leader in managing the complex cultural dynamics of the gathering. Her experience living in both white and Cherokee communities, combined with her daughter's natural ability to bridge cultural divides, made her an invaluable mediator when tensions arose between different groups. The triplets had become minor celebrities among the Cherokee visitors, their story of exile from white society and acceptance into Cherokee life serving as a powerful symbol of the gathering's larger message. Faith, hope, and grace moved effortlessly between Cherokee and white families, their presence a living reminder that the barriers between races were not as insurmountable as many believed. Faith had become particularly close to Little Fox, the Cherokee boy she had first met in Howling Wolf's war camp. Now nearly 9 years old, Little Fox had grown into a natural leader among the Cherokee children, and his friendship with Faith created a partnership that helped bridge cultural gaps throughout the gathering. Together, they organized games and activities that brought Cherokee and white children together in ways that challenged their parents' preconceptions about racial compatibility. Hope's gentle nature had made her a favorite among the Cherokee grandmothers, who appreciated her eagerness to learn traditional stories and songs. Under their tutelage, she was developing into a gifted storyteller herself, able to recount Cherokee legends in both English and Cherokee languages with an authenticity that impressed even the most traditional elders. Grace's work with Cherokee Medicine had evolved to the point where she was assisting walks with spirits in treating not just Cherokee patients, but white community members who had come to respect her unusual healing abilities. At just 6 years old, she was already demonstrating knowledge of herbal medicine that rivaled practitioners with decades of experience. The winter gathering's spiritual ceremonies began with the lighting of the great fire, a sacred flame that would burn throughout the entire gathering and serve as a focal point for prayers, rituals, and community bonding. But this year's ceremony carried special significance because it represented the first time in Cherokee history that white people had been invited to participate as equals rather than observers or converts. The opening ceremony was conducted by 7 Feathers, the eldest Cherokee spiritual leader present, a man whose authority was recognized by Cherokee people throughout the Southeast. At nearly 80 years old, 7 Feathers had witnessed the entire history of Cherokee white contact, from the earliest trading relationships through the devastating removal policies that had scattered his people across the continent. Tonight, we light the great fire not just for Cherokee people, but for all people who seek to walk the path of understanding, 7 Feathers announced in Cherokee, his words translated by Thomas Hartwell for the white participants. The Great Spirit has shown us that the color of a person's skin matters less than the color of their heart. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything that had ever taken place in Cherokee history. White and Cherokee families sat together around the great fire, sharing prayers in multiple languages while children of both races played in the firelight. The sacred pipe was passed not just among Cherokee warriors, but among white men who had proven themselves worthy of such honor through their actions and attitudes. Rebecca found herself deeply moved by the spiritual power of the gathering, recognizing in Cherokee prayers and rituals the same yearning for divine connection that had drawn her to Christianity. But more than theological similarities, she was struck by the Cherokee emphasis on community responsibility and mutual care, values that had been largely absent from the competitive, individualistic white society that had rejected her family. The most powerful moment came when Howling Wolf, the fearsome war chief whose hatred for white people had seemed absolute, stood to address the gathering. His words would be remembered for generations as a turning point in Cherokee white relations. 7 winters ago, I buried my wife and sons in soil poisoned by white hatred, Howling Wolf said, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. I swore on their graves that I would never show mercy to any white person who entered Cherokee lands. But the Great Spirit has shown me that hatred destroys the one who carries it as surely as it destroys its intended target. The war chief's gaze found Rebecca and her daughters, acknowledging the role they had played in his spiritual transformation. These white people taught me that not all pale-skinned hearts are filled with darkness. Their children showed Cherokee children how to laugh again after too many seasons of tears. Their mother risked her life to protect Cherokee families from white soldiers who would have killed without mercy. Howling Wolf's public acknowledgement of the Ashworth family's contributions to Cherokee welfare sent ripples of approval through the gathering. But his next words carried even greater significance for the future of Cherokee white relations. I have decided to lay down the war tomahawk, he announced, his decision shocking many of the warriors who had followed him through 7 years of resistance. Not because Cherokee people should surrender their rights or their dignity, but because there are ways to fight for justice that do not require the spilling of blood. The peaceful atmosphere of the winter gathering was shattered on December 15th, when a lone rider appeared at the valley's entrance, requesting permission to speak with the gathering's leaders. The visitor was immediately recognizable to Rebecca. It was Dr. Samuel Morrison, the physician from Millfield Creek, who had been one of the few voices supporting her family during their darkest hours. Dr. Morrison's arrival sent shockwaves through both the Cherokee and white participants in the gathering. His presence meant that the outside world had somehow learned of the valley's existence, and the implications were potentially catastrophic for everyone involved. "Rebecca," Dr. Morrison said, when he was brought before the gathering's leadership. "Council, I've been searching for you and your daughters since you disappeared from Colonel Harrison's patrol. The entire region believes you were recaptured and killed by Cherokee warriors." The physician's news was both alarming and oddly encouraging. If the outside world believed the Ashworth family was dead, then their presence in the valley posed no immediate threat to the gathering's security. But Dr. Morrison's ability to find them suggested that others might follow, potentially exposing the community to discovery by hostile forces. Dr. Morrison's next revelation proved even more disturbing. "Colonel Harrison has been using your supposed deaths as justification for his campaign against Cherokee communities. He's told his superiors that your murders prove Cherokee people are incapable of civilized behavior and must be dealt with through military force rather than negotiation." The irony was bitter. Rebecca's family, who had found more civilization and genuine Christian charity among Cherokee people than they had ever experienced in white society, were being used as propaganda to justify genocide against the very people who had saved their lives. But Dr. Morrison had not come merely to bring disturbing news. His real purpose was far more hopeful and potentially revolutionary. "There are people in the territorial government who are beginning to question Harrison's methods," he explained to the assembled leadership. "Politicians who believe that peaceful coexistence between white and Cherokee people is both possible and preferable to endless warfare. They need proof that such coexistence can work, living examples of successful cooperation between the races." The doctor's proposal was breathtaking in its implications. He was suggesting that the Valley of Two Peoples could serve as a model community, demonstrating to skeptical politicians and citizens that racial integration was not only possible, but beneficial to all involved. If successful, such a demonstration could change government policy and provide a path toward ending the cycle of violence that had dominated Cherokee-white relations for decades. The proposal to transform the valley into a showcase for racial cooperation sparked intense debate among both Cherokee and white participants in the winter gathering. Some argued that exposing their community to outside scrutiny would destroy the privacy and security that had made their experiment possible. Others insisted that they had a moral obligation to share their success with a wider world, desperately in need of hope. The debate continued for 3 days, with passionate arguments on all sides. Cherokee elders spoke of the risks of trusting white authorities who had broken every treaty and promise they had ever made. White residents worried about being branded as race traitors by their own communities. Parents on both sides feared for their children's safety if the valley became a target for extremists from either culture. It was faith, hope, and grace who ultimately provided the wisdom that resolved the debate. Speaking to the gathering with the moral clarity that often comes from children who have not yet learned to accept adult compromises, they argued that their unique upbringing had prepared them for exactly this moment. "We've lived in both worlds," Faith said, her voice steady despite her youth. "We know that white people and Cherokee people want the same things: to take care of their families, to live in peace, to have hope for their children's future." Hope added her own perspective with characteristic gentleness. The white people in Millfield Creek were afraid of Cherokee people because they didn't know any Cherokee people. If they could meet Cherokee families and see how they really live, maybe they wouldn't be afraid anymore. Grace, the dreamer of the trio, offered the most compelling argument of all. Grandmother Willow says that healing medicine is no good if you keep it hidden in a pouch. It only works when you share it with people who need it. Maybe our valley is like healing medicine that needs to be shared. Their words resonated powerfully with adults who had spent days debating complex political and cultural issues. Sometimes the most profound truths were also the simplest ones, and the children's straightforward logic cut through layers of fear and suspicion to reach the essential question: what was the point of proving that racial cooperation was possible if that proof was never shared with anyone who might benefit from it? The winter gathering concluded with a ceremony that formally established the Valley of Two Peoples as a permanent demonstration community, committed to showing the world that white and Cherokee families could live together in harmony while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. The decision was not unanimous, and several families chose to leave the valley rather than accept the risks that came with public exposure. But the majority remained, determined to turn their private success into a public witness for the possibility of racial reconciliation. Dr. Morrison returned to the territorial capital with a carefully crafted invitation from the valley's residents, offering to host visits from government officials, religious leaders, and journalists who were interested in seeing living proof of successful racial integration. The response exceeded everyone's expectations, with delegations arriving from across the country to study the valley's unique social experiment. Rebecca Ashworth found herself serving as the primary spokesperson for the community, her story of exile from white society and acceptance into Cherokee culture, providing a powerful narrative that challenged visitors' preconceptions about racial boundaries. Her daughters became symbols of the valley's success, living examples of children who had benefited from exposure to multiple cultures rather than being harmed by it. The publicity was not without its dangers. White supremacist groups denounced the valley as a betrayal of racial purity, while some Cherokee leaders worried that cooperation with white authorities would lead to cultural assimilation and the loss of Cherokee identity. Death threats were common, and the valley's residents lived with the constant awareness that their experiment in racial harmony had made them targets for extremists on both sides. But the positive impact of the valley's example far outweighed the risks. Politicians began crafting legislation based on the valley's governance model, which balanced Cherokee traditional law with American constitutional principles. Educational reformers used the valley's integrated school as a template for similar institutions throughout the region. Most importantly, the simple fact of the valley's existence provided hope for people on both sides of the racial divide who had begun to believe that peaceful coexistence was impossible. In 1863, as America tore itself apart in civil war over the question of racial equality, Rebecca Ashworth stood before the graduating class of the Valley of Two Peoples Academy, watching her triplet daughters receive diplomas that certified their mastery of both Cherokee and European educational traditions. At 24 years old, Faith, Hope, and Grace had become young women whose unique upbringing had prepared them to serve as bridges between cultures in ways their mother could never have imagined. Faith had become a lawyer, one of the first women in the territory to be admitted to the bar, specializing in cases involving Cherokee land rights and civil liberties. Her legal work had helped establish precedents that protected Native peoples throughout the Southeast, while advancing the cause of women's rights in ways that benefited all women regardless of race. Hope had followed her calling into education, founding schools throughout Cherokee territory that provided integrated education based on the valley's successful model. Her work had created a generation of Cherokee and white children who viewed racial cooperation as natural rather than revolutionary, laying the groundwork for a more just society. Grace had become a renowned healer, combining Cherokee plant medicine with European medical techniques to create treatments that were more effective than either tradition could provide alone. Her work had saved countless lives while demonstrating the practical benefits of cultural synthesis. As Rebecca watched her daughters accept their diplomas from Thomas Hartwell and Singing Water, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Cast out into a winter wilderness by people who feared difference, they had found salvation among people who valued compassion over prejudice. The cruelty intended to destroy them had instead led them to a destiny none of them could have imagined, serving as living proof that the barriers between human beings were not as permanent as those who built them believed. The Valley of Two. Peoples continued to thrive long after Rebecca's death, becoming a symbol of hope that inspired civil rights movements for generations to come. The community's example proved that racial integration was not just possible, but beneficial, providing practical evidence that would eventually help transform American society's understanding of human equality. And it had all begun with a Cherokee war chief's decision to show mercy to a widow and her 3 daughters who had been abandoned to die in the winter wilderness. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion carry within them the seeds of the greatest transformations. And the choice to save 3 lives had ultimately helped save the soul of a nation, struggling to live up to its founding ideals of justice and equality for all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.